Okay, so an odd video to start, really, because I don't really make content that's personal in nature very often, and that's what this is, which is why this is resolutely a Patreon only video, and the kind of thing that I would only do on Patreon, I think. I want to discuss the events of the last 10 months of my life, or a specific series of events, partly because it's perhaps cathartic to me to do so, and perhaps because it will be of interest to some of you, not least because I've alluded to some of these events on several occasions. But I wanted to give a bit more detail, and I can put a bit more flesh on the bones now, because there was a court case pending throughout it all up until about 2.5 months ago, and now that's been and gone and resolved, and so I can discuss these things because some of the details, or quite a lot of the details, have been mentioned in court. I'll obviously be giving my personal experience of some of these things, but the actual grisly details, I suppose, have all been out there in the public for of a courtroom. But this is something that I wanted to do. I would never do a video like this on YouTube. A, because I don't do personal videos like this, really. And the second is because some of the details, you can easily link it back to the court case from the dates and the sort of nature of events. And from that, you could get the address of my mother. And from the address of my mother, I just know that, you know, there's 140 odd people who are my patrons, and obviously all like my work and are decent people, as they wouldn't be supporting me. Whereas out in the wilds of YouTube, there's bound to be some twat who decides to send something disgusting directly to my mother's address. So I couldn't really do that because it could end with upset, really, for a family member, and there's been enough of that this past 10 months. So what I want to do is to try and describe what's gone on, because I know that I've made comments in the past as to how my output might be down for a few months, and duly was. And I know some of you know some of the details, that my father was murdered in his home. But I want to put a bit more flesh on the bones and tell you what's happened before the trial and since the trial. So it all happened on the 29th of January, really, of this year. And the details were that my father was murdered in his front room. We didn't know initially what had happened. My experience of what had happened is quite surreal, really. It was quite a nice morning. I was at home in the kitchen making a coffee, a fresh coffee actually, and the phone rang, and it was one of my two sisters, both about 10 years older than me. One of my sisters rang and said that her husband, my brother-in-law, had reported that there was a couple of ambulances outside my parents' house and some police cars, and he didn't know what had happened, and so he'd stopped, he'd spoken to the police, and he was ringing to say, but he couldn't say any details because the police wouldn't let him say any details, and she was very distressed, almost to the point of not being able to say not being able to describe what she was saying. And we had a little exchange, and I said, well, I'm sure I'm sure Dad's not had a heart attack, because he has had a heart condition, because I said if that was the case, it would just be police cars. And anyway, we couldn't really resolve it anymore. I said, well, there's no point me driving around there, it's a half-an-hour drive. We'll wait and see what her husband got back with next. So we put the phone down, and then I sort of waited in a bizarre state of limbo, knowing that something terrible had happened. I'd said to my sister I wondered if my niece Rachel had been involved, because she has had mental health conditions, and incidents have happened in the past regarding her. And I didn't know whether she'd done something. She's done things in the past which really should have been followed upon, but the nature of mental health care in the UK is not good, I can tell you. And she is resistant. She doesn't believe that there is anything wrong with her, and that's the problem. And on a couple of occasions where they've tried to section her, she's then at the last minute voluntarily agreed to be taken in, but then if you voluntarily agree to be taken in, you can sign yourself out a couple of days later. So it's a system that the UK doesn't seem able to deal with, but she's certainly a very disturbed young lady. So I assumed it was something to do with her and mentioned that. So I paced around the kitchen for a bit, made myself my coffee and sat there, and after about 20 minutes I thought, okay, I've got to ring up and find out what's going back. So I rung back. Sister was in tears still and said, John's rung again, he can't say anything, the police have still got him. And then while we were on the phone and I was trying to get her to calm down a little bit, her husband came through the door and she went off to say something to him, and then I heard a sort of shrieking and her coming back, and she got back on the phone and tried to tell me that our father had been killed, and she couldn't do it. She couldn't get the. She wasn't coherent, and there's a kind of a funny bit where I had to say, look, I can tell you're very upset, but maybe you should put your husband on the phone. I didn't call. I used the names. I don't want to use all my family's names. Put your husband on the phone, because you don't seem to be able to tell me. So she put him on the phone, and he said, James, I'm ever so sorry to tell you, your dad's dead. Looks like he's been murdered. So that was a strange situation. I think I responded in, I suppose, a sort of way you would if you can't really get your head around it. You either freak out or you're just very calm and collected and sort of take it from there. And that was sort of, I suppose, where I was at. And I asked him what the situation was at my mother and father's house, and he said that they're swarming with police, and he said there's no point going down. So there was then a very bizarre period of time. We put the phone down and I sat there. The sun was streaming through the window off the field at the back and streaming into the kitchen, and I'm sat there having a coffee, you know, and it's like tranquil, and you would not have known the sort of bombshell that had just been dropped. Anyway, I then got a phone call a little bit later. Facts came out in different orders, and I don't know quite what order. The sister that I've been speaking to is not the sister who is the mother of Rachel, whose name I will use because her name was in the papers, right? So that's okay. And so apparently her mother, my other sister, had gone. She'd heard the sister that had rung me had also rung my other sister, and she'd thought, oh my God, gone round to the house because she only lives right down the road, few hundred meters, half a mile from my mother and father, and she'd gone round and said, look, I think my daughter might be responsible for this, and then gave a description. And the police went round to her house, and Rachel was in the room. She'd been staying with my sister unbeknownst to the rest of us, because Rachel lives in Scarborough, quite a number of miles away, 50, 60 miles away, and she doesn't come around to stay. She doesn't get on very well. She's not seen my mother and father for about 3 years after an incident, which I won't describe, but an incident related to mental health. And well, I just won't describe it. But if I did, you'd be like, Jesus, that's pretty weird stuff. It involved a ritual, a naked ritual in the pond in the middle of night, and a lot of violence and talk of satanic possession and stuff. So since that had happened, she'd not been welcome at mother and father's house unless she'd sort of apologised for what had happened and stuff, because they felt scared. They're in the 70s, and they didn't know that Rachel had been in the area, but she had been. The police went round and they found her in the room and arrested her. And so then for the rest of us, there was a really bizarre period. My mother was taken. She was out doing some domestic work, which is what she does. She cleans at some people's houses. She's in her 70s, but keep a few pennies coming in, that's what she does. And the police went round there and spoke to her, and she ended up going to her friend's house. And We all met there. My sister Natalie, not initially, she was with the police, but there was a police liaison team there already, speaking to us all as we got in, asking us what we knew, asking us loads of questions. Being very good. They did a fantastic job all the way through. Actually, the police, they were fucking wonderful, I've got to say. I couldn't really have asked any more from the police, the way they dealt with us, the way that the professionalism of everything. And yeah, so we had this sort of strange situation. We're not a mega close family with loads of family occasions, and yet it sort of brought us all together, I suppose, in a way, in this terrible situation. And the police kept coming through and asking questions, bizarre questions, and the black humour sort of comes on with that. They're asking questions about, was there an axe? Did you own an axe? What did the axe look like? This is to my mother. And then about a packet of What's-It, then about a knife, then about a packet of What's-It. So I say the black humour were one of us had quipped about, so the murder weapon was either an axe, a knife, or a packet of fucking What's-Its, you know. And anyway, then for a period of time following all of this, it became clear that it was Rachel, and I got a bit of an inside track. The police didn't want to tell us anything because they didn't want any information to the press, but I became the liaison because my mother was upset. I became the liaison, the main point of contact with the police, and they would speak to me before they spoke to my mother, and I would sometimes ask my mother things on their behalf. And I got to find some of the details, and they'd got a lot of stuff, right? And it all came out in the court. An axe was found on the scene. It had the DNA of both my father and Rachel on it. The box for the axe where it had been purchased, and an Amazon order were found in Scarborough, where she lived. Her fingernail had become detached in the scuffle and was found at my mother and father's house. There was a knife found back at my sister's house in the room that she was staying at with my father's blood on it, blah, blah, blah. You know, there was no doubt. CCTV footage had picked her up walking round. We don't know whether, by the way, we don't know whether she knew my mother was out, because she doesn't admit, she still doesn't. I don't actually think it's not just that she doesn't admit it, she doesn't recognise that she's done it. It's a proper sort of split personality sort of thing. But she'd left the house. It's strange. She obviously isn't in control of what she does to some extent, but to the other extent isn't capable of premeditating something, but at the same stage is. It's so contradictory. There's no, like the police have said to me, there's no point trying to rationalise it, because this is somebody whose mental state is such that you're not going to be able to create a rational analysis of what has happened. But there was obviously some elements of pre-planning somewhere within her psyche. She'd bought the knives the week before. She'd bought the axe a few days before. She bought the axe before she'd come down and brought it with her. On the morning she had set out to do what she'd done, and yet even the psychologists don't believe that in a present state that she's aware that she's actually done it. That when she says that, well, they need to catch who's killed my grandfather, that she sort of actually means it. Very, very odd. But they caught her on CCTV heading in that direction. They have the time stamped, and then sort of 10 or 15 minutes later they have the timestamps of her heading in the other direction back to her house, or my sister's house where she was staying. But we had this situation as a family whereby my mother's house was sort of under police lockdown, with forensic teams. It was, you know, like you'd see on a fucking film, with them swarming all over it and everything sheeted off, and sort of including the front doors and things to keep air out and everything. My sister's house, and she's a hoarder, which doesn't help, as fucking hell. I've got a strange family. her house, because because the practicalities of it, which is that they said to me, we don't want to be indiscreet, but your sister does have a lot of things, doesn't she? And it would be quite an intensive police operation to do a full sweep of her house, so we want to see if we can avoid doing it. I said, no shit, she's got a full house. Yeah, so they shuttered off her house. They put metal shutters over everything so that nobody could get in there and tamper with anything. And she couldn't go in her house for a month. And the police don't provide anything. It's just like, well, you need to sort something out. Even to the point where the company that installed the shutters then billed my sister for putting the fucking shutters on her house. And she rung me up. I said, you need to speak to the police about it. Anyway, the police sorted that out, and she didn't pay for it, obviously. But yeah, so my mother was at her friend's for a couple of weeks until she got her house back. My sister, who couldn't get in her house, spent a week and a half here, and she has mental health issues of her own. She's very hyper, and that was a very, very difficult week. Imagine having somebody who just wants to talk at you constantly rehashing over things. It's enough to drive you mad. You perhaps understand where her daughter has cracked up, I think. And so she stayed at our house with a few days respite at my sister's, at the other sister's house, and eventually she got her house back. Well, yeah, and spending some days at my mother's as well. My mother, in the meantime, had moved back into her house. That was a difficult time. I had gone with the police. I told them I had some questions, and I said, we're not been given any information. And they said, well, look, we don't want to speak in front of all your family because we think some of them will find it too distressing. They're handling it in a different way to you. If you would like, we can give you the information, then you can decide what you pass on to the rest of your family. But please make sure it doesn't go any further, because it's germane to the case that will be presented in court. So I was due to go in the police station to get this information, and we got an appointment, but then they wanted to meet with me at my mother's house with a view to giving her a house back in the meantime. Because what had happened is my father's blood had been spilt all over the carpet, and huge amounts of the carpet had to be taken up, and they wanted to show me what it looked like and decide what we were going to do in advance of my mother going back. So we went there and we worked something out, and we shifted some rugs. There was the sort of head inspector of the case there, chief inspector who was in charge of, no, was he chief detective inspector? Is he I don't know, detective inspector or something like that. And he and his junior, who was sort of she was in charge of the case on a sort of day-to-day basis, and he was overseeing it. They helped me shift all these rugs round, and then we talked about the fact we were going to have this meeting, and he said, well, if you'd like to ask the questions now, I can answer any questions you've got now. So we had quite a difficult discussion where I was sat around my mother's and father's dining table, and we were discussing what had happened. I said, look, I'd like to know what had happened. And so pleased I did it, but it was a strange environment. The house was still and cold, felt sort of unlived in, and he was pointing across and saying, well, we think that's where your dad sat, and we think that Rachel came up behind him and struck him on the back of the head with the blunt end of the axe, and then he's got up and then she's stabbed him with a 12-inch long knife through the back, more or less between his shoulder blades, and then she'd stabbed him in the neck. They don't know which order this was in, and then stabbed him in the abdomen in a twisting wound. He was found, then they pointed out where he was found. His intestines had started to spill out. Then turned out in court, that you get more details in court, that it had cut through his aorta. Blood had spilt into his lungs. They got over a litre of blood out of one of his lungs. They don't really know which wound. They said, he had effectively 3 fatal wounds. It had gone through his jugular and his neck. It had gone through his aorta, and then there's this wound to the abdomen, which said that would be a fatal wound, but probably wasn't the wound that killed him, because that would be a fatal wound over a longer time period. But yeah, it was kind of odd having all that described in court. Sorry, in my parents' house. So then I then disseminated that information, nearly all of it, pretty much all of it, I think, to my brother-in-law. Much more limited amounts, all of it to my wife, limited amounts to my mother and my sisters, to one of my sisters, the sister who was the mother of Rachel. They didn't really want any of that passing on in case she was going to need to be called to court. So that was the end of that. I'd already gone and identified my father's body. Nobody else was felt up to that, so I just went down. My wife came with me. This had all happened. So then there was a kind of a lull period, I think, until the trial, and we tried to sort of get our lives back on track somewhat. You'll notice on my video posting, I kind of got back to making some videos again, and I tend to take things, I think, a little bit like my father does, and so he would get on with things. He'd want to know all the details, he'd want to do the right things, so I tried to do the same thing. Of course, we had a point where we could have my father's funeral, and this was after about a month, and I spoke at his funeral. Nobody else felt up to speaking at his funeral, but I had some words to say. I think I wanted to give, as I said on what I said, I owe my father quite a bit for the kind of person I am, for doing the kind of stuff I do on YouTube, actually, for having an interest in those kind of things. That's all attributable to my dad. And as I said in the little talk I gave, I wanted to get a feeling of... I said that really that if you're a religious person and you have a religious ceremony, that your feelings and your beliefs are explored, whereas if it's a secular service such as his, then they just get washed over. It's kind of like seeing that we might offend somebody. But I wanted it to be said that actually, you know, he didn't believe in God, and that he didn't think that he'll still be, from his perspective, he's dead and he's dead. But I wanted to read a little bit out, and I read a little bit that I knew I was always going to read when he died, because I'd thought about it for a couple of years. It's something that Richard Dawkins wrote in, I think it's Unweaving the Rainbow, forgotten now, where he talks about how we are the lucky ones, and of the the trillions of potential people who could be born, that we're the ones who get a chance. You can find this quote online. And he sort of, I can't remember it word for word, so I won't even attempt it, but that we shouldn't bemoan the fact that we die, but we should celebrate the fact that, you know, we've had a chance to live, however briefly. So we had that, we had the funeral, and then we waited for the court case. My sister, who was the mother of Rachel, was due to be at the trial to give evidence, but then she wasn't needed at the last minute, so she decided she didn't want to attend. My mother really didn't want to attend. My other sister, my other sister didn't feel up to attending either. But I wanted to go there, partly for my own good, and partly because if I didn't attend, then my mother felt like she'd have to attend. So I think even if I didn't want to attend, I'd still have ended up attending. But I wanted to hear what was said in court, because there isn't a full there's a written record on the on the notes that is taken down there by the court clerks or whatever, the transcriber or whatever they're fucking called. But there's no actual recording of the case, so I wanted to hear it for myself and see exactly what there was, exactly what evidence they'd got in totality, and check the proceedings were done right. So I went down. My wife accompanied me. They gave us some days compassionate leave to do that, which was good of them, as did my work. And there was Rachel's father, who's been divorced from my sister for, 20 years now, I think, or maybe more, maybe 22, 23 years. And he was there, get on okay with him, and so with his partner, and So we were there. It took about 4 days, 5 days. Court days they don't get much done. And Rachel wasn't there. It was kind of a strange scenario. What it was what's called a trial of the facts, which was that there were 2 psychological reports, one for the defence, one for the prosecution, but both of them agreed that she wasn't fit to stand trial. Because, of course, for a murder conviction, you need 2 components, actus reus and mens rea. And to have the mens rea, the guilty mind component, 2 things need to be the case. At the time when the crime took place, you need to have sufficient mental capacity to be culpable for your actions, but also at the time of the trial, you need to have sufficient mental capacity to be able to stand trial. And neither of those things could they be certain was true. What they have said is that, so they had a trial of the facts. What they have said is there could in the future be a murder trial if her mental condition improved, because then you could still test in a court of law whether she had the mens rea, or guilty mind, and the mental capability at the time the event took place. So you could test that in front of a jury. But given that she didn't have the mental capacity for the trial, you couldn't really test that because she couldn't properly be able to stand in a witness box and defend herself, etc., etc. So that's the issue with it. So they had what's called a trial of the facts, where there were 2 verdicts rather than guilty and not guilty. There's not guilty and the facts are proven. So that's what happened. And the judge was exceptional, I think. It's interesting is that people often slag off judges as aloof, a sort of aloof upper class. What do they know about the normal person? And this guy, Judge Robinson, he was called, I think. He'd just been promoted, actually. We had to go to Sheffield each day. He'd been promoted from the court in Hull, the Crown Court in Hull, to the court in Sheffield, and to be sort of like the head judge there. And so he'd taken the case across with him, which is a bit of an inconvenience for us because it was an hour and a half's drive every single day in each direction. But he was very good, and he is properly, I would say he's a kind of lower upper class, right, to hear him talk. So you could have that kind of inverted snobbery, but you could not fault any aspect of him. His compassion, but his dispassionate and disinterested nature, which you would expect of a judge. I mean, the evidence in this case was overwhelming to such an extent that defence counsel had been arranged. There was 2 defence barristers present, senior and a junior barrister. They didn't present a case for the defence because literally there was no counter narrative that you could make. I mean, it would have to involve aliens from outer space or something, you know, or government mine probes or something. There wasn't a defence case, and they talked to the jury and said, look, this is going to seem really strange that we're not providing a counter narrative. We're here to see that all the evidence is presented properly and that Rachel gets a fair trial, and just the fact we're giving not giving a counter narrative doesn't mean that you've got to find her guilty. And the judge was emphasising this, that you can't read anything into the fact that they're not providing a counter narrative. But all the procedures were still done properly, and to me it would have been so easy. For me, it was a going through the motions thing. There was no other verdict that could possibly given other than well, not a guilty verdict in this case, but the facts are proven verdict because of the nature of the case. But nevertheless, the judge couldn't have done any more to disabuse the jury of the notion that this is a foregone conclusion. He said they've still got to take everything serious. The evidential burden still has to be met to just the same degree, and just because there's no counter narrative being presented by the prosecution, they're not to count that in the disfavour of you know, the defendant. Really good, really. And like I say, you hear the slaggings off that the police get and that people like judges get for not doing a good job or being sort of aloof and not having the interests of people. You know, in both cases, I think the police did a wonderful job in everything, the way they dealt with the family, the professionalism at which they did everything. And at the same time, you couldn't have I couldn't fault the judge. He couldn't have done any. And once the verdict was given, that the facts have been proven, then the mask slipped, because he would talk to us. The interesting thing is, because I've been in a jury before, and you only see that one side of it. But then watching the case, you see the mask slip, because he'll dismiss the jury for 10 or 20 minutes, and then he'll talk to the court, and then he's talking about the jury and how things should be presented and how shall we deal with this next part. And the prosecution and defence counsel, the barristers and him, are deciding, well, look, this is what we ought to do, and maybe this would be wrong to present this in this way, and all this lot. And they discussed the situation of Rachel and already put some things in place in case the jury found the verdict that they all assumed that the jury would find. But then as soon as the jury had given their verdict, he thanked the jury and said, I couldn't say this beforehand, but you've given the best verdict, really, for everybody involved, because it means that we can make sure that this young lady receives the care that she needs. He said in his summing up that he thought that she'd probably never get out, that she's under, what she's under is, I can't think of the names for it. He gets to decide on the sanction. What he said is, he said, right, there'll be a further hearing next week where I'll make the sanctions. He said she'll obviously get, now I can't think what it is. There's a court order and then another order. And I might get them the wrong way around. There's two types of order. One of them is under the Mental Health Act, and it's the order upon which she is detained indefinitely until a condition is such that she no longer has the psychological conditions and that she's safe to be released. And that would be on the say-so of two separate psychological reports. But then he put a higher level, the highest barrier that he could put in, which is used in quite exceptional circumstances, which means that it would also have to be referred to the Home Secretary, and the Home Secretary would have to decide as an ultimate sort of gatekeeping exercise before she could be released from the mental health unit that she'll be held in. So, but he was very, very concerned that she would be sent to a place that she would get the right kind of treatment. So, yeah, I couldn't really fault any of that. So maybe I've gone on a bit long about that, but that was an odd thing to go through, all of that trial, really, and to sit through all of that. And then it's all kind of over. Or at least that was what I thought. My two sisters very much rallied round my mother when it all happened and tried to do as much as they could, and we all went round with my mother when she went back in her house to try and ease the blow, because obviously her going back to live at her house is going back to live at the house of a murdered husband, and it's been a terrible thing for her to have to deal with, as you can imagine. But then, as of a couple of months ago, and this is going to seem weird to you listening, but it's no less weird for me, actually, both of my sisters decided that they weren't going to speak to my mother ever again, for a series of things, some of which are so trivial, so mind-bogglingly trivial that you could hardly believe that anybody would voice them, including in the case of my sister who isn't the mother of Rachel. Her daughter had stayed for a few days with my mother, and my mother had criticised her cooking, criticised my sister's cooking. That was one of the things. I mean, this is a woman in her late 70s who's just lost her husband. He's been murdered by his niece. And now 2 of her 3 children have decided that they're not going to speak to her ever again. Or at least until she apologises for these things. And this is how wicked, I think, the whole thing is that particular sister, this is the sister who'd rung me on that occasion in January, on the 29th of January when my dad was killed. She rang me again. I don't speak to her that often, other than recently because of all of this, and she rung me and said, I need to tell you something that Mother has said. Mother has said that the only reason we go round to see her is because because we want the inheritance, because we're after her money. We're after her money when she dies. And I've decided I'm not going to speak to her again. That's it. I'm not contacting her. I don't want anything to do with her. Right? And she's like, I thought you might want to know in case you didn't want to speak to her. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding. She's a 70-year-old woman. I said, if she said that, maybe she's feeling hurt or something. You know, are you serious? You're never going to speak to her again? And so, anyway, I won't relay all of that conversation. But seriously, she was trying to conspire a situation where none of us would speak to my mother ever again, I think. I can't get my head around that. So it's kind of exploded. I can't really shed any more light on all of that. They seem to have grievances with my mother that have come out of thin air, over some of the most trivial shit you could ever imagine. My sister, who is the mother of the niece who did the stabbing, criticised my mother. One of the things she holds against her, she's worked off and on and had problems for several years now, as a result mainly of her own fucking making, to be quite honest, spending her whole fucking life trying to have affairs with married men and packing jobs in so she can go and live near them, and then they don't leave their wives. She's not done herself any favours or a whole load of other people any favours, but as a result of that, my mother was constantly helped her out. And part of the reason my mother has carried on doing domestic work is that most of that money has gone straight out of her pocket to support my sister, who doesn't have a job and can't seem to get any work now, which is a tragedy actually, because she started off originally having a very, very good job. And anyway, one of her criticisms of my mother said, how can you say I don't care for you? I must have given you about £30,000 over the past 10 years, on top of a £50,000 loan she's given her to help her keep a house above her head, a roof above her head. And she said, well, yes, mother, that's how you show love, through money. As if that's a bad thing, as if like she held it against her that she stopped her being out sleeping rough on the streets for the past 10 years. It kind of beggars belief, really. Anyway, that kind of brings you up to date. So as of 2 months ago now, neither of my sisters have anything to do with my mother, and I've sort of took it upon myself, A, to spend more time with my mother, but B, also to make it quite known to my mother that I'm not as fucking nutty or heartless as either of them, and that, quite honestly, even if she had said things like that, I said to my mother, I said, look, honestly, there's nothing that you could say to me that would make me never speak to you ever again, right? You're in your late 70s. You might sometimes say some harsh things. You might criticise me. You might call me a twat. You might sometimes say some cynical things towards me. I said, if you do, I won't just refuse to, which one of my sisters did. She just stopped answering the phone. She just refused to. It wasn't like she confronted my mother with these things. Why have you said these things? Will you retract them? She just, no, I'm not even going to speak to her. I said, if you've said something that offends me, I'll come and see you about it, you know, and see if we can resolve something. And I said, even if we can't, well, then I might hold that against you a little bit, but I'm still not going to disown you. So that's all been a kind of unavoidable trauma, perhaps, and then an avoidable trauma on top of that, really. So that's it. Yeah, I just thought you might be interested in some of that, maybe cathartic, to get it off my chest. But as you can see, I'm back to sort of full strength on YouTube and get on with things. My little, more nuclear family with my wife and my little boy is all sort of strong and functional, so that kind of helps with that. Okay, just thought you might be interested in that, I suppose, and it's just interesting to put you in the picture and to sort of get it off my chest a little bit.